from AI, who we've heard from in some of the other panels this morning. So for this afternoon's panel, we're going to focus on AI advisory boards broadly, and the kinds of questions that we want to focus on is to try and map what a regulatory response to a very uneven AI landscape might look like. And it's uneven in several ways, and I'll just go over a few as a prompt to my panelists to follow. It's uneven in that there is a big north-south divergence in the development of large language models, and we'll speak about some of that. But there's also a large variety of AI companies in the field, some very large and some very small startups. And when we think about designing regulatory models, we have to imagine this kind of very varied institutional landscape. But we also have a divergence in the regulatory norms that people might bring to the AI space. So there are those who might think that what this calls for is strong legislation or strong regulation from governments, whereas there are others who might persist with a stronger self-regulation model. What might bring about self-regulation by AI companies? What kind of self-regulation works? Is it self-regulation that is independent, that is binding, and so on? These are the kinds of questions that are critical at this point in time. Critical not only in the sense that the technology is at an inflection point, arguably the political economy of the industry is at an inflection point, or some might say past an inflection point. So this is the context in which we are having this conversation, and we are hoping to spend more time on the question of regulatory governance, institutional design, than on questions of technological governance. I know that many people in this room would suggest that the answer is technological, and that if we leave it to the companies to devise default technological protocols and norms, that will do the work. But much of the conversation that we will have in this room this afternoon is going to be more legal, regulatory, and ethical. So that's the bias to the regulatory question that we will take into the conversation this afternoon. So the format that we will follow is broadly that I will give Julie first the opportunity to talk about these broader themes, and also to advance a description of a model of which both Julie and I are a part of, that we think at least responds to some of the questions that I've raised. Then move to Saurabh to describe what he sees a company like Sarvam AI navigating a regulatory landscape in India, an emerging company in the field. How does it see questions of regulation? What kinds of regulatory models might they be enthusiastic about or less enthusiastic about? And that's the format that we'll follow, roughly about 7 minutes apiece, and then I will help with a small discussion and then open it out to the audience for a moderated Q&A. So that's the format. So let me start by inviting Julie to get us started. Julie.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sudhir. And please bear with me. For some reason, my voice just went out, so I apologize if you do not have the privilege of hearing my very normal and very beautiful voice most of the time. Joke aside, to respond to your initial question, Sudhir, about what does a good advisory board look like for AI companies who want to who care about safety without wanting to sacrifice innovation and profitability. I think the model that we have created over the past few years at the Oversight Board is one that merits way more attention. And what I wanted to do before explaining why, I wanted to ask if anyone in this room has ever heard about the Meta Oversight Board or the Oversight Board. Oh, it's pretty nice, thank you. It's a little bit more than what I was expecting, but still not the whole room. So maybe for those who do not know the Oversight Board, it's an independent body that was created in 2020 by the most powerful social media company in the world, which is Facebook at the time, and now Meta. And what we do is that we make binding decisions on the content moderation decisions that Meta has made. So for instance, when Meta decides to take down a piece of content, if you are concerned by that, you can appeal to the Oversight Board and say, oh, I'm not happy my content was taken down, or I'm not happy someone else's content is still available and it's dangerous and it's violating the rules of Facebook. So you can appeal to the board, but the company itself can also appeal to the board when it is struggling to apply its own rules. And you might not think it, but it happens more often than we might imagine. And we do so through a group of 22 people who are located on the 5 continents. So me, for myself, as my colleague has said, I am from Cameroon in West Africa, close to Nigeria, so maybe more of you will locate. And I'm also from France. We have colleagues in Taiwan, in Australia, in the United States, so many places of the world. And also we have 21 different professional backgrounds, because some of us are law professors, some of us are activists, civil society organizations, some of us are journalists. We have the former editor-in-chief of the Jakarta Post. In Indonesia, we also have the former editor-in-chief of The Guardian. And some of us are lawyers. So it's a very diverse organization that gathers together to decide on individual cases, so individual pieces of content. And what's interesting with the work that we do is that our decisions are binding to Meta. So when we tell Meta, you should have taken down or you shouldn't have taken down, Meta is obliged to apply whatever we tell them to do in the specific case. Now, what's interesting is that we're also able to make recommendations, policy recommendations, that the company will apply. Well, it's not obliged to apply them, but it commits to at least explore how it can apply those recommendations more broadly on all its products and all its platforms. And so, I apologize. These are the 2 very important elements of a very successful advisory board. Independence. I cannot be fired by Mark Zuckerberg or Joel Kaplan or whoever at the leadership of Meta because of a decision that I've made. We have fixed terms, 3 fixed terms of 3 years each. And we control our own strategy. We control the members that we recruit. We're not going to be influenced by Meta. If Meta says, oh, we don't like this member, don't recruit that person. On the contrary, that's what's going to make us hire that person. But in addition to that, our content decisions, as I was saying, are binding. And that is the most important part when you do an advisory board. What we see usually is advisory boards' role are sometimes in the shadow. You don't really know what the company does with whatever recommendations that the board will give the company. In our case, Meta has publicly committed to apply what we tell them. And even when they're not obliged to do that, in the case of recommendations, they will still explain why they will not apply this recommendation, why it's so challenging. Maybe it's a resourcing problem, or maybe it's a priority problem, or maybe so many reasons. So it offers a sort of transparency and transparent dialogue on the issues that the company is facing. And it's successful because we're not giving advice that, you know, are completely irrelevant for the industry. 75% of our recommendations have been applied by the company, have helped the company be better, treat better its users, be more transparent, and be more accountable. And that's what explains partly why, for some of us, it's easier to trust some of the products, including AI products proposed by certain companies like Meta versus others. Another very important aspect that I wanted to touch upon, and then I'll stop there, Sudhir, is that our framework is not solely ethical. We don't only look at the ethical angle of the questions that we have to deal with. We look at a very specific framework, and that framework is the human rights framework. That framework gives the right to free expression, for instance. That framework gives the right to know. That framework gives the right to safety. That framework, so many other very important rights to privacy, which have very specific guidelines when you want to apply them. And this is what we help Meta do. We help Meta not only say we respect human rights, we actually help Meta in the operational aspect respect those human rights on a daily basis. So I'll stop there for now, Sudhir, and we can dive further.
Yeah, I mean, Julie, I do want to come back to hear more about the AI side of the question, but let me bring Saurabh in first and prompt Saurabh really to speak about, for an emerging Indian company, one of the biggest in the Indian technological landscape. How is Sarvam AI thought about regulation? Do you already have internal mechanisms that you use in this way, or is there something that you find more or less attractive?
Hello. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I think at Sarvam, one of the things that we have done in our journey is to be constantly in touch with the regulators themselves and with the government themselves, and be very intentional with respect to how we want to build the technology that we are building and how do we want to deploy it with what guardrails. And that's why you don't see directly consumer facing application. There are like other challenges also around it. But I want to pull us back into the reality of where we are at, right? This technology itself is very, very new. I mean, 1.5 years back, if you basically asked a company to guarantee that for the same inputs they had the same outputs for a model, it would have been very, very difficult to impossible. And so while we said that we don't want to touch technology part of it, right? The technology matured, and now there are systems which can guarantee these things. So one, we are in a landscape where technology is maturing. But I think from a Sarvam standpoint, we already had anchor examples of what safety could look like. And so the community has done a great job with respect to building, data sets, which tells you that these are the kind of things which are the negative examples that you want your models to be aware of, and techniques to guardrail your models to not give certain kind of responses and things like that. Those are data curation is something that we have worked heavily on. And so we have ensured that whatever data is fed inside the model is of high quality, and so you do not really face the kind of problems that you see in models that were like 2 to 3 years old. And obviously those models have also become much better. But by and large, what we have been able to do is we have been able to work very closely with civil society, be very, very constantly in touch with regulator to understand what are their expectations, how do they want to see. Because ultimately what we are trying to do is we are trying to find out what is the best way to deploy this technology for advancement of what. And I think as a company, we believe that we want India to win. And that's why a lot of our effort in building this technology is continuing to be for India in that sense. So that's my response to that.
Yeah. So if I just stay with the India guidelines, AI guidelines for a moment. So the India AI guidelines make it clear that that government is going to pursue a regulatory strategy that emphasizes innovation as much as restraint. So it's the bias is not towards a heavy regulation model. At the same time, the regulatory framework sketched out mandates accountability. The accountability section speaks about accountability at various levels, at the entity level, across the industry, national level, and so on. And in a competitive business environment where you may at this point have a lead in the Indian context with Indian languages and large language models in this context, but in a competitive landscape, one can reasonably expect that the boundaries will be pushed, and you're going to have to deliver both technologically and in a regulatory sense. So, in the initial stages, the approach might be that we emphasize the innovation part, but do you see a future set of steps? I mean, just last week we saw new deepfake guidelines notification being issued. They're not guidelines, they're binding. And they seem pretty strong and harsh by most industry standards around the world. So do you anticipate that regulatory model will play out okay, or do you think there's a scope for something else in the Indian context?
Yeah, I think we have examples of very, very strong regulations like the notification that you just mentioned. We also had an incident where the government did for certain time mandated that you tell us when you are going to be releasing an LLM. But I think one of the things that we have seen is we have also seen them adjust to what the industry is saying. And so it's not one-sided conversation that's happening. I think both sides are reacting to this, and it's coming to some level of stability. Going forward in future, I think companies' own governance. So, for example, we definitely do a lot of like red teaming of models, dog fooding of these systems ourselves to be sure of what we are releasing. When you talk about accountability, it's not just at the model level, and so in the entire supply chain of an AI application, you have you have hardware providers, you have model providers, then you have people who are building systems, and then people who are deploying systems, right? Having an understanding of in what context are you using these models with what kind of guardrails is very, very important, right? And so you could be using an LLM in a high stakes environment where you have no benchmarks or do not have enough depth of understanding of how it would perform, right? And then the question basically gets back to your liability framework of like who basically is accountable for these things, right? And so each person in the entire value chain has to have certain accountability of their own context and how they are sort of supporting development of these models. With respect to government, I think companies already have mechanisms to dog food these systems internally. I think one thing I know that these systems are diffusing faster than social media did. And so they will also become very, very global soon. And so the kind of advisory boards that we would have for internal governance mechanisms is something that I do not really know just yet what it would look like. There's also an aspect of, these systems are going to get very, very complex, very, very fast, right? And so if you look at coding agents or things like that. So you have an example of deep fake, but what I also foresee is that a lot of humans are going to delegate their agency to have agents sort of transact with other agents, right? And then some of those regulatory frameworks may not really be ready today to respond to some of those situations, right? And so regulators, companies, civil society, everyone will have to have very fast cycles of stimulus and response. And I think that's the key part, right? I think all three parties in some sense are trying to get to benefits for the society. And the only way we will be able to actualize it is by ensuring that the information is not is passed on at the right time, and whatever is mitigatable gets mitigated fast.
So thanks, Saurabh. So you're emphasizing that regulatory models will have to be nimble, maybe even regulatory institutional design will have to be a little different from what we've seen. Standard departmental regulation might take too long and then might end up on the wrong side because of the quality of technological understanding behind these regulations. Julie, just to come back to you to push on this institutional design question, right? so two elements. One, I wanted you to just speak a little more about the AI side of the question. The Oversight Board was initially set up to deal with social media content, but we've ended up dealing with a lot of AI content and AI inflected content, which is a big part of the issues of the day. But thinking beyond that to the question of institutional design, Saurabh mentioned that if it's not state regulation and if it's not just a private company regulation, then what would it be? What could it be, rather? And these are both interesting questions, which we have some evidence on. I mean, nothing is decisive or conclusive here, but at least there's some evidence on what kind of regulation works. Julie?
Yes, I think it's as we're entering, or we're in the midst of the AI revolution. It is important to take lessons from the past, from the recent past. What happened with social media? We were all very excited. Oh, it's amazing, we can connect. And then very suddenly, we started realizing that there were bad things happening also on social media. Aggressions towards children, women, minorities, hate speech, disinformation, and so many other harms that are being discussed. So if there is one thing that we can probably learn from that as we are in this AI era, is that inevitably, all these great benefits will come also with potential problems. The advantage, and maybe to respond specifically to your questions, Sudhir, and to pick up on what Saurabh was eloquently presenting, maybe the solution is in between. Because on the one hand, indeed, regulators, and that is one of their most important criticism, they are sometimes very slow, or they don't understand innovation. That's another criticism that we hear. And in that sense, it's very reactive. Whereas in the case of the Oversight Board, and we've seen that, we have had examples in which we have been extremely proactive, even before the regulator even saw a problem or imagined a solution. One example is 3 years ago when ChatGPT came with this big announcements. At the time, everybody was concerned about, oh my God, how are we going to make sure that what we're seeing is really is either AI or it's the reality. And at the time, every company was saying, oh no, it's so impossible, we don't have the technology yet to decipher, to identify what's AI and what's not. One of the cases that we received was related to the former president of the United States, Joe Biden. In this specific case, it was not AI per se, but it was a modification of images, of visual images. And in this case, it was an image that pretended to show him doing something that he was not doing, being accused of, molesting children, etc. It was not at all true. The video had been doctored to show that, or exaggeratedly doctored to show him doing something illegal. And what we saw at the time is that the policy of Meta was absolutely not adapted and prepared for AI. It was just, at the time, the policy was just covering certain type of modifications. It did not cover, modifications to the extent that you would think that something, well, it did not cover deepfakes, for instance. We're all talking about deepfakes now. 3 years ago, we were all warning about it, but there were no real rules, including within companies, to deal with those. And what the board did is we made a series of recommendations to the company in that specific case. So of course we told the company to take down the content that was showing the president doing something he didn't do. And in addition to that, we told the company, we have consulted with stakeholders, because that's what we do. We don't make our decisions just on our own. We rely heavily on collaborations and conversations with stakeholders, such as everyone in this room. And by the way, we have a case ongoing, and you're all welcome to participate in that. I'll give more details later. But we made a recommendation based on our interactions with AI experts who told us it is actually possible to allow either people to label AI themselves when they create AI, or the company can do it. They have the means to identify some form of AI-generated content. Meta did that, And the result was spectacular. They had billions of interactions with the AI. I don't know if you remember, at some point you started seeing on Facebook products, Instagram, for instance, you could see AI generated, or you would be asked yourself to say whether you're posting a generated content. That label was interacted with by billions and billions of users. I think it's 3 billion. I don't have it's so huge that I don't even have the figures in mind, but it was in the billions. And what it showed us is that people are eager to understand. There was a thirst for understanding how can we identify AI, what is even AI generation? And that label led to more information provided by Facebook to external sources or to internal sources within Meta. And Meta was the first company to do that 3 years ago. And now everybody does it. So I think it's a little bit in the middle.
Do you want to say something about the institutional side of the question? So Saurabh mentioned AI safety boards, and several global companies have set up AI safety boards. Some have set it up and dismantled them.
Yeah.
There is a push towards AI safety institutes of some sort of quasi-governmental AI safety institutes, partly policy-making, recommendation-oriented kind of institutions. And then we have the oversight board structure, which is not a AI safety board in the way that some of these have been set up, not a AI safety institute, something quite different. So a little bit of attention, because my sense, and I'll just say 2 more sentences about this, that questions of AI regulation and FATE frameworks, for example, we've been talking about it for the better part of nearly a decade. That we've been discussing what should the normative principles for AI regulation be. And I think the real challenge, I know Saurabh said that it's kind of experimental technology, but Saurabh, the scale of growth of AI and the scale of impact and market depth really puts it out of the realm of, you're not at beta stages. You might be, and you might be announcing a model shortly, but the industry is really at scale already. So I don't know that we can take that this is an experimental technology approach to the question. We might have to say, yeah, the technology is out there, it operates at scale. We'll have to choose make some regulatory choices now before things go dramatically out of hand and we're picking up the pieces. So that's my sense of the timing question. But Julie, just a prompt on that institutional question before I come back to Saurabh.
Yes, if I can maybe share some lessons learned. If you want to build a successful AI advisory boards, here are the elements you have to keep in mind. First of all, boards where companies retain membership control tend to not be as successful. Advisory bodies that do not have enforcement mechanisms tend to be not as successful. Governance structures that can be dissolved at the sole discretion of the company, or even the government, because there are also advisory boards set up by governments, is also not a board that is likely to succeed in its mission. Another very important aspect, lack of transparent reporting or on implementation is also not good. You have to be able, and this is something that the board does, we report very frequently, quarterly, on where we are at in terms of implementation. Meta, we recommended this to you 1 year ago. You said you would do this. Where are we now, a year later? So that was for the don'ts. Now for the do's, absolutely critical, a human rights-based decision-making framework. Ethical and human rights-based. I really want to insist on that. Secondly, protected independence. Third, make sure the communities being served are represented. As I said, we don't make decisions just on our own. We work and consult with stakeholders from civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations as well, and many others. We have transparent operations. We publish our annual report every year. You can read how many decisions we've made, how many recommendations were applied by the company or accepted by the company, how many were rejected also. This one is a very interesting piece of information. And another very critical and last critical success criteria is making sure they are meaningful company accountability mechanisms. So when we say something is not working within the company, what happens next? That question is fundamental. So.
Thanks, Julie. I'm just going to go back to Saurabh to go at this question of state regulation baselines and then company self-regulation models, which is the direction that the India AI guidelines also point towards. And so we'll have to evolve something which may look different, but it will have some combination of these two elements. So clearly the state will set some default liability rules across the sectors, maybe topical on some issues, and then companies will have to do the rest and work out some way of being responsive to your users, to the public at large, because the nature of these technologies is that it's pretty much going to be open to anybody to come and use. So you have to account for your users' actions in some sophisticated way because they're using technologies which are not very deterministic. So the kinds of outputs that they generate would be quite wide. So circling back to the Indian context and the context for this summit, because a part of the motivations for this summit is to say that if we have inclusive and sort of an AI for all kind of model, what would that model look like? It would clearly have a regulatory framework. So just to come back to you, I mean, I know that, I don't want to make it a Sarvam question. It's not a Sarvam question, it's just in the Indian landscape, where do you see this going?
Yeah, I think very broadly, you would have regulations, you would have laws, and you would have guidelines, and you would have self-regulation, right? I think all of them are going to coexist. I think it's about like striking the balance, right? With the regulation, the real challenge and the opportunity really is like how surgical can you be about issues, right? And so let me give you an example. If you really wanted your platform to not have any AI generated content, images, right? You should ask all hardware manufacturers to sign the images and verify it and only then allow them to upload it on your platform, right? And then assume that anything else which is not hardware signed is AI generated, right? And so sometimes it's about like, how practically can you implement some of these things, and that's why probably the regulations of the future will have to be techno-legal in that sense. That is one aspect of things. And there are definitely regulations are going to set some baselines. Internal governance mechanisms are going to proactively ensure that the companies do not get in conflict with the laws. I don't think anyone really wants it, but I think industry standards could play like a very, very important role, right? Like you could have certifications, you could have certain process audits that ensures that safety has been taken into account, right? Like similar to how you do your information security checks, and those kind of certifications could signal both to the market and create obligations within the organization to ensure that known mechanisms of ensuring safety are not let go of when you are building some of these systems. And the accountability, again, as I said, right, like varies across the value chain between a model developer, system developer, person who is basically deploying it to communities. And I mean, I just want to also echo the fact that none of this can happen in the isolation of a company, right? And that's why companies, civil society, regulators will all have to have very fast cycles of like, conversations on how to deal with the current situation.
Yeah, I want to just, you mentioned hardware manufacturers taking some kind of responsibility here. Just one last question before I open it out to the audience. You'd spoken earlier also about technological models of regulation. I know that that's not been the focus of the panel. We're focused more on the legal regulatory structures. But if you were to cast your eye on the technological models, is it like the red teaming frameworks that you have in mind, or is there some other kind of more promising framework that you think might do the job?
I think standards which are composite of many things is really where it'll go to, right? Like, so for example, you would need to do benchmarks. You would need to do red teaming. You would need to do sample set. This again varies by the size of company, right? Like companies who are, in more than 100 countries, who have really large deployments, right? And companies who are very, very nascent, because just to put us back into the context, we are trying to do it in the context where innovation doesn't get hindered, right? And so setting some of those standards, aligning with the maturity of an organization, and these standards being compound of many known processes that we can take for safety and security is really where we would have to go. Some of those mechanisms are going to be technological, right? Like for example, benchmarks, right? Let me give you an example. If you go to Ministry of Education's website, you go to Bodhan AI, you would see like a bunch of education related benchmarks, right? And so by releasing some of these benchmarks, by actively funding, fueling, be it civil society organizations or researchers, to set up some of these baselines would allow for developers also to build compliant AI. And those are not purely in the realm of regulation as much as in the technology. So what we have to keep the goal in mind, that we want to build safe and trusted AI, and we have to build these composite systems of safety where which is both a mixture of like governance mechanisms where you are able to keep people independent, who are able to sort of identify issues and report it and get it fixed, but you also need to provide enough tools to for developers to sort of fix these things. I'll just give an example to put it more in perspective, right? Let's say the governance goal is to ensure that all websites are WGCA compliant. That basically means any person with visual disability is able to access these websites, right? Now, pre-Gen AI era, look at all the websites, and you would not really, find appropriate tags in the HTML, and then they are not accessible, right? And so, if you agree with me that the future websites are going to be built by these models which can write code, right? They do not, by default, put out a WGCA compliant code. You either have to prompt it and things like that. But if regulator basically comes and instead of like passing a notification or a judgment, incentivizes the society to build a good benchmark, a good data set, now suddenly what you can ensure is that all websites in the future which are built by AI models are WGCA compliant, right? So there is both an aspect of exponential inclusion and alignment with the regulation as well as exclusion in that sense. And that's why this is a very unique situation where you will have to think both technologically as well as governance mechanisms that allows people to sort of have control independently.
Yeah, thanks, Saurabh and Julie. So we have time for questions. So I'll open up to you. I'm going to move the mics around. My colleagues have some mics to get us started. Can I start with you first? Because you had your hand up first. First off the mark, please.
Hi, my name is Jyoti Pandey. I work with Georgia Institute of Technology. Julie, we've interacted before. I've been involved with many of these multi-stakeholder content governance mechanisms. I've just conducted a study comparing the GIFCT, the Christchurch Advisory Network, and the Oversight Board, and developing a classification criteria to assess how advisory bodies function, and what are some of the key criteria that are necessary to make them function in an effective manner. And so I have three sets of questions for each of you. Julie, to you, you mentioned of all of the benchmarks that advisory panels need. How important is funding? Because like you mentioned, the oversight board has it has scale. It's spread out over continents, but it's obviously got there with Meta's big upfront commitment. And how does that, considering that Meta as a company has now shifted and said that we're going to take a hands-off approach, content moderation. So, that also throws up a lot of these funding into a little bit of, there's no inevitable future. And also broadly, Sudhir, to you, and also to you, sort of very interesting points about the transformation of technology. How are liability frameworks keeping up with this technology framework? So for example, I've worked on Manila Principles. I was one of the authors of the Manila Principles. And at that time, we were thinking of liability frameworks and approaching it from the perspective where platforms are not really reckoning or dealing with content directly. There is a benchmark or a established criteria of actual knowledge, which is when they're being notified of illegal content or some kind of, non-conformity with the law, and that is when they have to take action. But we're now moving into technological environments where there has to be a sense of predictability. So how do we then approach liability frameworks from, that very notional, broad shift that is undergoing? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll probably take 2 more questions. So no, here, sir. I'll pick one here and then one. Yes, second one.
Thank you. After listening to the discussions by all of you, my attention was arrested when I heard the human rights. You just mentioned human rights plays a very important role in contextuality to regulatory reformation. In that context, the human rights plays a very important role. So far AI is concerned, because I'm a man of English language and English literature. I teach students going to abroad. I have AI students also, they come. Therefore, my focus is that when we speak about advisory content, advisory governance, and when we speak about strategic regulatory reform as per India AI intelligence sub-boards, whatever the panel in our government of India has been given about AI is strict about the governance internal and external, where the AI impact should have allegiance, should have corroboration with human intelligence also. In order to have internal governance properly in the field of AI and artificial intelligence, what I want to say with full clarification that assimilation of intelligence combined with associative intelligence leads to artificial intelligence for the growth of humanity. And that is welfare for all and happiness for all.
Thank you. Can just move it at the back of the hall? Yeah, just because it can't be all the people in front. Right at the back. Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Kathy. There in the middle.
Hi, my name is Vakasha. I'm currently working with the government on the summit. I actually wanted to ask a question around this because at a previous organization I'd worked on an ethics committee for an AI company at the time. What I wanted to ask is that so for instance, what is Sarvam doing and in the oversight board, like what would be your preferred way for going forward for enforcement of a policy within it, right? So suppose you have your policy that, okay, look, we don't want our AI to be used for XYZ purposes, we're going to make sure these guardrails are there. How do you actually make sure that that works out within your company itself? Because there's going to be competing interests between the business side, between the product side, between sales. So what's the kind of mechanism which you guys are thinking is there in place, and where does that fit in the institutional structure of a company to make sure that you're able to actually follow your own internal rules and guidelines around it?
Yeah, thanks, Vakasha. So Julie, maybe one round of responses. We have time, so I'll come back.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll start with your question here about the funding model. The money that the company put is in a trust. So it's a trust that manages all the money and how it's being spent. And we directly interact with the trust at the oversight board. Now, that does pose a very important question. What's the sustainability of such model? And on that, we are reflecting on whether it would be important for the industry as a whole, because what we've seen with the board is that the decisions that we make are not just applied by Meta. We've seen other companies apply them, just not saying they do. And what we see is that there is a shared interest within the industry for bigger companies and for smaller companies to sort of create industry standards, as you were talking about earlier, because it actually benefits everyone. It helps get rid of the uncertainty that comes with sometimes with innovation. So some of the things that we've started thinking about within the board is whether there could be shared governance infrastructures between different companies, whether industry associations could actually have part of their responsibilities become a sort of governance structure support for including small AI startups who want to do the right thing but don't necessarily have the means of a Meta or the like. So these are things that we're exploring, and The last question, sorry, I will go to the gentleman's question. How do we ensure the enforcement of policies? One aspect that that I really want to insist on is the constant dialogue that exists and the implementation side of the work of the Oversight Board that we have been doing with Meta. There's a constant dialogue. We have frequent meetings. We said this a year ago. Where are you? Why this is not happening? And this allows the company also to share the difficulties that they might be facing, which we might not think of as an oversight body because we're so impatient to see our recommendations applied. But there are realities that we also need to be aware of. So I would say a constant dialogue and close collaboration between the stakeholders in the oversight body and stakeholders in the company body.
So on the question of liability framework, at least till last month, I thought that liability framework is like, there is nothing, I mean, like the technology is unique, but if you look at it purely from the liability framework, from a product liability framework, I think it adequately covers what you have today, right? But what I'm also seeing now happen is that you increasingly have these agents who assume your agency and then act in a virtual world on your behalf, right? And so the kind of intents that humans are passing to these agents are very high level, right? Like, so I could pass an agent that go and make 100 rupees for me, right? And I will also assign it a wallet from which it can actually make transactions. So it can send in some money and accept some money, right? And when this happens at a scale, by the way, right, like, you don't have virtually any cap. You have the compute cap in terms of the number of agents that can exist, right? And so is it sufficiently, are our legal framework sufficiently evolved to carry, govern everything there, right? Like, do you attribute all the mistakes to the end user who has delegated agency? I don't know. So the answer to your question is actually, I don't know. And I think it'll be a interesting exploration to see, like, because this intersects with everything, right? Like, it intersects with your finance, it intersects with your, research on chemistry, biology, everything, right? Like, and so, so I don't know is the most honest answer that I can give you, and I think that is why it needs to be explored. With respect to, how do you ensure that the companies are actually following these guidelines, right? I don't think companies are, it's a unique problem in the sense that, companies are not malicious entities who don't want to comply for the heck of, like, just not complying. In fact, we do. In fact, that actually benefits our business, right? To give you an example, if you're not an ISO 27001 SOC2 Type 2 certified organization, it'll be an extremely hard sell for you to sell whatever AI you have to BFSI, period, right? And so now imagine if there is a company which basically says, oh, by the way, my models basically generate really good marketing content, right? Which you could use to sell loans, sell insurance, educate your end user about financial literacy, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there is a regulator or academic body which has come up with a very good benchmark to assess the veracity and the safety of these images. And one company has that certification and the other one does not, right? You have to think of it from a very economic standpoint, whether the incentives are aligned for the companies to comply or not, right? Like, so companies do prioritize for the business sake actually to comply by these standards. And that's why if you have like really good standards built, again, both technological as well as governance mechanisms, I don't foresee any challenge in companies not doing this. If you have very, very difficult governance structures imposed on companies, right? There needs to be space for the dialogue to happen. And I think eventually everyone wants the economy to grow for the people to benefit, and that is how you reach the equilibrium. So my succinct answer to this is, companies do comply by standards, build good composite standards, we will comply by it, and we will report. Whether we do, I mean, you can say like, disclose your data, and maybe that is an option. You can also say that, an external auditor can come and, look at all of these systems, right? That happens in case of information security quite a bit, right? But these are not mature just yet, and that's why there is work that needs to happen in defining these standards, and companies are willing to comply by them.
Yeah, no, I like the analogy to information security kind of regulation, which is sort of, you can say, analogous field, though my sense is the analogy breaks down pretty quickly with AI. So I'll just mention that. I don't want to get into that in greater detail. I just want to speak to the comment from the back about complexity of organizations. Clearly, external independent regulatory bodies allow for better communication within large organizations. Most organizations are complex, at least large organizations are complex, they're polyvocal, different people have different objectives, they even have different normative frameworks that they operate within. So in a sense, external independent oversight allows for better conversations. I don't think it's linear in that it means that only one kind of line of one view gets to drive the day. It never ends up like that in large organizations. But I suppose that independent oversight allows for that, for better communication all around, even within companies. So I'll start at the back. I think we have time for, I'll say two. So I'll just start with, I'm sorry, I can't come to you. Yes, at the, person in the yellow, if Carolina can just get a mic, because you had your hand up right from the start, and then you, sir, and we'll stop. Yes, but I can't have all three people from the first
Hello.
row. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you. So I have kind of a two-part question.
And you'll have to be really quick
yeah,
because
very
we
quickly.
have all of 2 minutes.
I'm actually currently an ISO 42001 auditor, so this is what I've been doing, is auditing companies with respect to that. My question is at the interface of like content moderation and this kind of auditing, because like very recently in the news we saw that there was a social media which was for AI with AI, by OpenClaw, I think was the one that created. So so my question is, in the regulatory and governance framework, what are we going to do about, I'm sure new ones are going to come up, like I think Moltbook, there's going to be new platforms that are going to come up. So in the governance and regulation framework, how are we going to go forward with platforms like Moltbook?
Yep, thank you. And then, just the person in front of you. Yeah, Carolina.
Thank you very much, sir. And time is short, but I would be quick. One that I compliment you for trying to regulate the unregulated. So you have a tough job, and you deserve all praise for that. I have two quick questions. One is that the very fact that you are an advisory board, I would like to know that the company is not obliged to implement your advice. They may or they may not. And we see blatant violation taking place. So how many times your advice have been rejected? That is question number one. Question number two is about regulation. Building up standards. I'm SD Saxena, I worked in telecom for almost 40 years and was involved in telecom revolution in India. I worked in ITU, I was chairman of a group. Can it be outsourced to organizations like ITU or UN for building up standards where the regulation will have meaning because the countries will then be obliged to implement it? Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Two good questions. So, Julie, do you want to go at the international institutions regulation, ITU, UN question, as well as maybe the enforcement question, please?
Yes. So on the international level, I do know that there have been convenings at the international level about regulation of AI, and actually UNESCO was one of the first organizations to adopt an international text on the ethics of artificial intelligence. That was in 2020. So I think it's very much open, and it's important that indeed those international organizations, governmental organizations, have a role to play. We see the UN working group has done a fantastic job in surfacing so many of the issues that we're dealing with right now. So yes, very much agree with you. On the, what was the first question again? Oh yeah, no, our decisions are binding for the company. The recommendations, although they are not binding, the company must respond to those publicly. They say, we cannot implement, we will implement, and when.
So just to clarify, the distinction that we tried to make was between an advisory board that's purely recommendation based and an oversight board of which decisions are binding. So a part of our decision-making framework is binding, and I think that's the point that was being reflected. It's only for the meta platforms, Facebook and Instagram. But Saurabh, just the last point, yeah?
I wanted to. Yeah. No, I'll just tell you a very interesting anecdote, right? So what did we see in last 1 month is a social media for agents, right? And another very interesting thing that happened is that on a particular GitHub repository, which was an open source code, an AI tried to contribute, and humans basically shunned it out, right? Said that it's only meant for humans to contribute, not for agents, right? And now, in a hypothetical scenario, if this agent basically goes to a social media platform, uses API to basically, bash a particular human who has basically shunned it out, right? And the user has just put this OpenClaw on their MacBook Pro, and this agent is completely autonomous, running there. Would you consider that a user-generated content and hold the user liable, right? And some of those questions are not very easy to answer. I mean, yes, from the current liability framework, obviously, it's your MacBook, it's your agent, you prompted it, it went there, it wrote something, right? But some of these things are not very, very clear today. And so it's very hard to predict future and sort of like do those kind of things. And that's why I don't find a good analogy in terms of like how do you regulate it. Of course, you need these governance boards who can guide these things, but I feel humans themselves are like quite inadequate in terms of like predicting exactly what would happen, right? I don't think anyone expected that you would suddenly have these social media platforms for agents and things like that. So you need to continuously that's exactly why I keep coming back to it, right? Our rate of response to stimulus is really what we need to optimize for, right? And that's where we will find unique solutions to some of these problems. And we can't wait for all problems to appear, and we also can't be in a haste to predict what problems we want to govern for.
Thanks, Saurabh. Can I just invite everyone to thank our panel for this wonderful session? And thank all of you for your patience. Let's hand over to the next crew.